Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, a deadly shooting in the Caribbean. 4 people are dead after Cuba says it returned fire from a Florida-registered speedboat near the island's coast. A confrontation that could inflame already tense relations in the region, coming as Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets with Caribbean leaders. We'll have more on what this could mean for U.S.-Cuba ties.
And from podium to policy, President Trump touting a new era of American winning in his State of the Union despite slumping approval ratings and a legal setback to his tariff agenda. Senator Roger Marshall and Bloomberg contributor and former House Speaker pro tem Patrick McHenry join us to assess the policy path ahead and the political stakes heading into November.
Plus, the partisan divide. The president also took direct aim at Democrats, blaming them for inflation, border policy, and the DHS funding impasse.
Look, nobody stands up. These people are crazy. I'm telling you, they're crazy.
Democratic Congressman Joe Morelle was in the chamber and joins us with his reaction.
And breaking after the bell, Nvidia earnings are out, the forecast blowing past expectations. And the stock is up after hours on signs the AI boom remains strong.
And that's where we begin tonight, with Nvidia delivering better than expected results and forecasts. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, the host of Bloomberg Tech, is joining us live from San Francisco now with the breaking details. So, Ed, obviously on first blush, the market likes what it's seeing, but we're still awaiting details from the call.
Yeah, it likes the outlook for the current period, fiscal first quarter, the April quarter, where sales will be $78 billion plus or minus 2%. And what was interesting is, despite some sort of comments to the contrary earlier in the year, Nvidia is saying that that outlook does not assume or factor in any revenues from China. In parallel to the earnings statement, they dropped a 10K, a regulatory filing, saying that in February this month, the US government did grant them licenses to export H200s to specifically named China-based customers. Those exports are subject to inspection and review in the United States and, as has previously been discussed and reported, subject to 25% tariff. But the bit that Nvidia does not know is if China would let them in. Right, so very interesting developments in the quarter, but generally speaking, strength on the top line, strength on the bottom line, and their customer base continues to be dominated by those 4 big hyperscalers plus Meta, making up more than 50% of sales.
Ed, as we stand here, at least before the call, and some of the details you're going to bring to us later, is what's good for Nvidia good for the rest of the neighborhood? We see Broadcom rising, Taiwan Semi, Micron. Is this how it's going to play?
Yeah, look, the disclosure that more than 50% of sales is still the hyperscalers is important because a lot of the market was traded following the capital expenditures guidance of those names. That's important. There is an issue which all of that industry is facing, that demand for the compute exceeds the industry's ability to supply. That's an enviable position to be in. But what Nvidia says in its CFO commentary is that they have secured enough inventory and supply to meet demand for several quarters. That might have some supply chain ramification, but I'm almost certain that Jensen Huang and the rest of the management team will get very specific questions on how they were able to be nimble in that environment, and also like how far afield their view of the world is, because they gave an outlook for the current period, but typically, bearing in mind they just closed the fiscal 26 year, Nvidia doesn't say, okay, formally, here's what we're guiding for in a year's time. It doesn't work like that. However, what they did say did project a lot of confidence.
Well, so when we consider the questions they're going to get on the call, Ed, if you could ask one, what would it be?
Yeah, look, I'm a big consistency guy. And in CES in January, Bloomberg's Ian King was sat next to me, and we asked Jensen Huang, you have this fit forecast for $500 billion US, which just is sales of the Blackwell-based systems and the Rubin-based systems. And what we asked him was, are you tracking beyond that? Jensen Huang said yes, and he said that part of that was that they do think they'll get some revenues from China. Well, in their official earnings statement, they've just said that they're not assuming any revenues from China. So what happens next? They've got the licenses. Will they actually go ahead and be able to do some business in that market? Because as you guys will appreciate on this program, there is a political sensitivity to it and a national security question about whether it is right to export any generation of technology into China for competitive and national security reasons.
Really important moment to share with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Ed, thank you so much. We'll check back with you a bit later this hour as the call gets underway, and we'll keep our eyes on shares of Nvidia. There was a bid under high tech during the cash session today on Wall Street, sent the Nasdaq up over 1%. The latest from Salesforce, though, after the bell, may sour some moods, if only in the software space. And for more, we turn to power moves now with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic, who joins us live from New York. Romaine?
All right, well, let's start with the software space. You take a look at the IGV, which is one of the main ETFs that actually tracks those names, and it's actually in the red, and that's largely because of the persistent concerns here about the rollout of some of these AI tools and how it will continue to disrupt some of those companies. That includes Salesforce, which just reported earnings, and we should point out its conference call started at the same time as Nvidia, so a bit of a choice that investors have to make over who you really want to listen to here, Mark Benioff or Jensen Huang. But overall, we should point out, this is the outlier, Joe. Right now, tech stocks across the board, with the exception of a few software names, are solidly in the green, largely because of the bump that we're getting from Nvidia. It's hoping to boost some of the chip stocks, only modestly, but you're seeing names like Taiwan Semi and ASML, as well as Broadcom, higher in the after-hours trade. Also, those big hyperscalers, your Microsoft, your Oracles, Googles, if you will, also moving higher as well. Overall, you put that together, and you are getting a slight bump up here in futures heading into tomorrow. Now, only modest, only up about 0.2 or 0.3%, and that kind of owes to the fact that there really wasn't a whole lot more upside room to go. You still had Nvidia, which has, of course, been on a phenomenal run. It had pulled back just a little bit here, but the market reaction way more muted than what we would have seen a couple of years ago, where you'd have seen a double-digit move, percentage move in the stock. I would also say keep an eye on some of the hardware makers, and that's going to be key tomorrow, Joe and Kaylee, because we're actually going to hear from a couple of those names, including Dell, which has, of course, not only been a big beneficiary of the AI boom, but last time I checked, I think Sir President Trump said, well, he likes Dell. He actually told everyone to go out and buy a Dell. So we're going to find out when they report earnings tomorrow whether that actually helped in its most recent quarter.
Yeah, Michael Dell getting a shout out in the State of the Union for matching the Trump account investments for babies. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic, thank you so much, as always. Now we turn to some developing news involving the U.S. and Cuba. Cuban forces today killed 4 people who opened fire from a speedboat with Florida tags, an incident that has the potential to escalate an already tense standoff with the U.S. following weeks of bluster from President Trump. For the latest on this fast-moving story, we go live to Bloomberg's Miami bureau chief, Daniel Cancel. So, Dan, what do we know and what don't we know at this time?
Hi, thanks for having me. Thus far, we really only have the Cuban version of the story, which is, as you mentioned, 10 occupants in what they call a speedboat about a mile off the coast, who apparently opened fire first, and the Cuban military returned fire, killing 4, injuring 6. And apparently the 6 were taken to Cuba for medical aid. They haven't released, names, nationalities, or, what they suspected they were up to in terms of the activity. And from the U.S. side, really, thus far, it's been very silent, right? So the Coast Guard is essentially referring comment to state. The White House hasn't commented on this situation either. Here in Florida, the governor's office says that Governor DeSantis was briefed by the Coast Guard, but they haven't issued a statement yet. The AG of the state said that they, called for an investigation. So really, a lot more questions still than answers.
Interesting. Dan, we're lucky to have you on this story, and I wonder if you can just zoom out a little bit and paint the political picture in the Caribbean, knowing that the administration has been taking a very tough line against Cuba, suggesting that the government was already failing. We know that oil is not getting in, or gas, and that it's difficult to find a steady source of power. This is clearly a regime that was already teetering. If the U.S. considers this an act of war, what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, thus far, I would tend to think that this, could be more linked to a smuggling operation. We ran kind of the registration, and our reporting shows that it's an older boat, maybe built in 1981. More a fishing boat, and it may indicate that people were either trying to bring goods into Cuba or even ferry people out. Until we get more answers, it's really hard to say. But the backdrop, as you mentioned, it's a tense time, since January 3rd, when the U.S. detained Nicolas Maduro, who was the biggest ally of Cuba, things have changed dramatically, right? So, Trump's shut off that valve of energy that was going to Cuba to keep the lights on. And he's pressuring other countries to do the same, right, in terms of aid and fuel, including Mexico. And so, the only thing we've seen in recent days is the U.S. is actually now approving energy exports to the private sector, right? Which for the first time, which seems like a new strategy to essentially try to empower, businesses and entrepreneurs on the ground and weaken the regime.
Well, I guess it's a question of just how weakened the regime really has become, because, of course, President Trump just last month, Daniel, and we can play a soundbite of him saying this, has suggested it could be ready to fall. Take a listen.
Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know if they can hold out. But Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. And Cuba literally is ready to fall. And you have a lot of great Cuban Americans that are going to be very happy about this.
Dan, do we have a sense of what would come next if that fall indeed comes about?
It's a really good question. One of the big questions amongst, analysts has been, who is the Delcy Rodriguez in Havana, right? So if in Venezuela we got Delcy Rodriguez stepping in for Maduro and now essentially playing nice with the U.S., who is that figure in Cuba? And we don't have a firm answer on that. There are some versions, whether it's the grandson of Raul Castro or a few other players. But until we get better clarity on who's willing to step in and change, this 6-decade economic, system and political system, repressive system, it's very hard to envision what that looks like next.
Dan, thank you for the help with this story, and we'll continue to monitor developments with the help of Bloomberg's Miami bureau chief, Dan Cancel. Coming up on Balance of Power, how Capitol Hill is responding to President Trump's State of the Union address. We were on Capitol Hill last night, and we'll discuss ahead with lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas, Democratic Congressman Joe Morelle of New York, all ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Tonight, 4 years and 1 day since Russia invaded Ukraine, Presidents Vladimir Zelenskyy and Donald Trump spoke by phone to discuss the next steps in the peace process. Zelenskyy saying he discussed preparations for a meeting between negotiators, as well as further peace talks involving Russia. This just a day after President Trump called for the end of the war during his State of the Union address. For the details on this and more, we turn now to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who is joining us live from the North Lawn of the White House. So, Kate, yes, President Trump did mention this in the State of the Union. I believe it was one sentence in an almost 2-hour-long speech. Do we have a readout yet from the White House as to how his conversation with Zelenskyy went today? I would imagine it was a little bit more detailed than that.
That's right. It was not a big focus of the State of the Union last night. The two leaders have spoken today, but we do not yet have an official readout from the White House. Right now, what we have is what Zelenskyy has posted on social media. He's given us some details about what the two discussed. They talked about the issues that are going to get brought up tomorrow in Geneva. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were also on this call, and they're going to be leading the talks for the U.S. side in Geneva. I also want to note that Zelenskyy said, we expect this meeting to create an opportunity to move talks to the leaders' level. As you know, Kaylee, that would be a very notable next step in these talks. There are supposed to be, tomorrow is just going to be the U.S. and Ukraine sides talking. It's going to be a bilateral meeting. But in early March, we are expecting there to be another trilateral, which is, again, a very notable moment and opportunity for the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine to discuss some of these very thorny issues that have been keeping peace off the table so far.
Kate, what's the follow play to the State of the Union? Obviously, this is when we tend to see cabinet officials start to fan out across the country. The surrogates start doing their work. The president seems to think he had a slam dunk last night. He certainly set a record for the longest State of the Union ever delivered in human history. How about the political side?
That's right. It's been very interesting here at the White House. You know, it's been a very quiet day. The president had a lot of closed-door policy meetings on his schedule. We have not yet seen the president on camera. We have not heard from him today on camera. He has been posting on social media, but it seems to me like there is a real effort by this White House to really just let the speech last night, which, as you mentioned, was the longest State of the Union address in history, really just speak for itself. He covered a lot of ground last night, touched on a lot of issues, and really was an attempt to shape the narrative of how he believes his first year in office in his second term has gone, and really trying to hammer this economic message, really sell the idea to the American people that his economic agenda, as he says, is working. And that's a message that they're going to be talking about over and over again ahead of this year's midterm elections.
Okay, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan reporting live from the White House. Joining us for more on the president's address last evening and how he expects to sell the agenda to voters in the days and weeks ahead. Former Republican Congressman of North Carolina, former House Speaker Pro Tem Patrick McHenry, a Bloomberg Politics contributor. Congressman, great to see you. I should say, Mr. Chairman, the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee as well.
A bunch of former.
Yeah, exactly. So you can speak freely.
Now.
So this is interesting, the day after here, when you try to say so much in a 2-hour span. I wonder how much is left to resonate with the American people, or is it the old nobody watches past the 30-minute mark anyway, so that's where he made the biggest dent?
So this was a lot, and I think what we're going to see is pieces of this pulled out over weeks for the messaging for the White House and House and Senate Republicans. You also saw that from the Democratic response. So much of that is also repackaging, if you will, kind of putting through ChatGPT all the Democratic talking points and getting them out, too. So all of that is there. We now have the set piece for the two parties going into the midterms, point one. Point two, the Trump address seemed much more akin to the former longest State of the Union address by Bill Clinton in the 90s. And it was this laundry list of greatest hits, right? Very particular targeted policies, speaking to this constituency and that, and covered that way. In the Trump era, it's like, whoa, this is a lot of Trump, right? Yes, but he went through the greatest hits, recognizing great Americans, doing so in a way that really resounds, right? In a different era of politics, that would have been the sweetness of the speech, of the awards that handed out. We're in a different era now. But the particulars of those policies, those things we're going to see in much more detail, and they do hit those constituencies, like Bill Clinton was trying to do going into his reelect in 96.
Well, but by nature of it being greatest hits, these are things that the president has already done. Are we now talking about a president whose greatest hits, at least of his second term, are all going to be behind him? Because, yes, he had some asks of Congress, passed a stock trading ban, maybe the Save America Act, but none of them are going to be another big, beautiful bill of the size and scale at which we've already seen, right? I mean, how much realistically, legislatively, can this president expect to accomplish going forward?
Little. And the majorities in the House and the Senate would indicate that.
Yeah.
This was about doing two things. One, getting the Republicans back on side. There was some softening among Republican voters in recent polling, not among primary voters. They're still hotly enthusiastic for this president, like very few parties have been that closely aligned with the president, especially going into their sixth year of office. Consolidating Republicans and getting onside those independents, that constituency that he brought to his election in November of a year and a half ago. Those two things are about the midterms. So some of that is just consolidating what you needed people to remember. The border, the success of the border, we haven't talked about it. The question of tariffs. The emphasis the president has of tariffs is because he loves tariffs. The way the American people need to hear the tariffs is a mechanism for them to get jobs back in the United States and for their wages to go up and the cost of things that they buy to go down.
Well, and he said last night to replace your income tax.
Well, yeah. So there's a lot going into that, and some of that is wishful, yes. But the tariffs need to be spoken to, and where this administration needs to pivot to is the deal with Xi. And a new trading relationship with China. That actually wasn't a big set piece of the State of the Union. nor was what we're obviously seeing with the buildup, the massive buildup in air power in the Middle East right now. Those two things will define the year and could define his presidency, but they were very little talked about last night.
Interesting. So you've described the politics pretty well. Let's talk style, and I know there's a lot of crossover there. The second half of the speech, things started to get a little dark and certainly confrontational. We got with the yelling back and forth with Ilhan Omar and so forth, and I suspect that was part of his plan, kind of like when Joe Biden did the same rope-a-dope with members of the Republican conference. You were there for that.
Oh, yes.
I know that this is kind of the new game here, but to have the President of the United States and the Speaker's rostrum say Democrats cheat, it's the only way they can win is by cheating, and they are in fact crazy. The word crazy was in the President's script last night. Where do you go from here? We fall off our chairs?
The crazy was in context to their policies, not actually calling them crazy. Although the back and forth of two members of Congress screaming profanity at the president was actually a new low.
So you thought the Democrats had the decorum problem last night?
Well, so Hakeem Jeffries wants to be Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
The road to this House majority is not through just your activist base. Mm-hmm. It is through the moderate voters that are swing in a midterm. You need to persuade them. That is part of the coalition.
Yep.
What Leader Jeffries was trying to do is get his crazies to stay at home so that they did not become the story. The story was about whatever Trump said. That didn't actually work. So the reasonables said, that's fine, I'll take the pass. I won't go listen to the president's speech that I don't really want to listen to anyway. Not a hard task there. So who showed up? Well, some of the people I know very well, and I know very well that they're going to act out. So your gadflies showed up for their own purposes. Congressman Al Green, who's going through this major Democratic primary that he's facing in Texas, gets the first one pulled out by the Sergeant of Arms.
Just like last year.
Sides. And then Omar and Tlaib yelling at the president, the back and forth with the president. The president firmly enjoying it, frankly.
Yeah.
So that moment, that flashpoint was the thing that Leader Jeffries was trying to de-emphasize and not effectively doing it. But what he left was the optics of the chamber being a Republican rally at the State of the Union without the tension, the back and forth of the booing that we've seen of previous State of the Unions. So the style is on both sides. The goading by the president was a purposeful act when he says, are you standing for illegal immigrants or with the American people? Stand up. So, the Democrats who were there mostly took the bait. Stock trading, interestingly enough, Elizabeth Warren stood up and clapped. So populism from the progressive left to the populist right, they've met up somewhere on the other side of the planet.
No doubt.
As we got to see last night.
We have less than a minute here, Mr. Chairman, but if President Trump were to take the same speech and the same message on the road between now and November, would it be net positive for Republicans? Does it improve their chances in the midterms, or does it just not do harm to them?
It does not do harm to them. That is helpful. The policies that he's indicating, Trump accounts, bringing down the cost of prescription drugs, however we want to debate it, all the populist stuff that was in the second half, right? Second half. That's the stuff that Trump voters want to hear. And the Trump voters need to be brought out to the polls in order to save the House Republican majority and to make sure that the Senate doesn't flip. That is the primary goal of the president's messaging right now, is that consolidation. It's not about moving the left to the right. It's about consolidating that base. That's what we got. And that was a double down, triple down in Trump terms, bigly getting the coalition back together.
Wow.
Or at least attempted.
Always appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Patrick McHenry, the former Republican congressman of North Carolina, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, here with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Now the same people in this chamber who voted for those disasters suddenly used the word affordability, a word. They just used it. Somebody gave it to them, knowing full well that they caused and created the increased prices that all of our citizens had to endure. You caused that problem. You caused that problem.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. The president there last evening in the State of the Union blaming congressional Democrats for the rising cost of living as affordability, of course, becomes the top issue heading into the midterm cycle with elections a little over 8 months from now. But I'll remind everybody, Texas, North Carolina will be voting in primaries next week. And joining us now with his reaction to the big speech last evening is Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas, who serves on both the Senate Finance Committee, Senate Budget Committee. We saw you walking through Stat Hall last evening, Senator, and I'm sure you enjoyed the speech. There's been a lot of comparisons to Bill Clinton, interestingly, this morning, simply for the length of time. He actually eclipsed Bill Clinton for the longest State of the Union in history. But I wonder if he invoked that "I feel your pain" message that Bill Clinton was so well known for, knowing that prices have been dogging people. Beyond blaming Democrats, did he acknowledge some of the challenges that people are living through?
I think so, and even more than that, gave him a message of hope of how we're digging ourselves out of this hole. Like you're pointing out, Joe Biden gave us 4 years, 50% inflation in housing and child care, health care, property insurance, those types of things. So we are in a deep hole. And I think the president said, okay, we've stopped the digging, and now we're starting to climb our way out of there. So I think mostly said, here's this message of hope. Macroeconomics look really good. Real wage growth was up $1,400 per job last year. That wages grew $1,400 per job over the rate of inflation. We got the price of gas coming down. The rent has come down 6 months in a row, the lowest rent in 4 years as well. So we're digging ourselves out of this hole. And I do think that President Trump gave this feeling of empathy, and that, again, that here's this message of hope that last year we set the table, this year it's the banquet.
Well, and of course, Senator, President Trump maintains that key to this economic messaging, empathetic as you put it, is the idea that he is enacting tariffs on our trading partners in order to benefit economically the American people. We know he's having to change tack a little bit thanks to the Supreme Court, who has said his IEEPA tariffs were illegal. He suggested last night that there are other means he can pursue to enact those tariffs, that Congress is not needed, even though last I checked, Senator, I do believe the Constitution grants you the power of the purse. Should you be needed here?
Well, there's always this conflict between the three branches of government. That's the way the Founding Fathers meant it to be. As I read the Constitution and the laws, it looks like Congress gave him some more authority, that this Section 122 is going to allow him to have 3 months at a 10 to 15% tariff, and then he'll use those 301s as well. But regardless, what we do know about the tariffs is, number one, that inflation is in check, so the tariffs did not cause any more inflation, and they allowed the president to negotiate 10 trade deals with our 10 most important trade partners. He's used it on a geopolitical scale as well, forcing India to buy oil from America rather than Russia. So we do see some really good things coming out of those tariffs.
You're, of course, representing the great state of Kansas, and you serve on the Ag Committee. With that view from agriculture, Senator, do you need to see exemptions when it comes to soybeans or other crops, regardless of where the president sets these new tariff rates? You pointed out 122. That's only good for 6 months. 301 could look a lot different. How concerned are you about farmers in your state?
Well, look, I think the only way that China buys soybeans, so just 2 weeks ago, China doubled their soybean purchase. The only way they buy them from us rather than Brazil is because of these tariffs. The problem, the challenge in agriculture are input prices right now. It's the cost of fertilizer, the cost of chemicals. Again, they went up some 50% under Joe Biden, and they're not coming down yet. So I think that we can do some tariff relief on fertilizers. That's the moment as well. But President Trump has used these tariffs to negotiate really strong trade deals, specifically on value-add products. The American farmer makes money is when we turn corn into beef, when we turn sorghum into ethanol, that type of thing. So these trade deals that we've done are definitely prioritizing those value-add products.
Senator, you, of course, have a seat on the Budget Committee, and there's been some conversation, whether it's with the aim of codifying tariffs, which you may not think is necessary for Congress to do, or with other aims to enact the remaining elements of the president's agenda, of a second budget reconciliation package. No. Do you see any real prospect of that happening in a midterm election year?
I do, and I'm working towards that project. Specifically, the president wants us to focus on bringing down the cost of living, the cost of housing, the cost of health care, child care, property insurance, those types of things. So I think, healthcare is my specialty. You heard the president talk yesterday about Trump RX and codifying that in some way, as well as clipping the wings of the pharmacy benefit managers. And then our signature bill, of course, is our price tag bill, which forces every healthcare provider to show you the cost of your procedure, your lab, your x-ray up front as well. We think that by increasing competition, it'll bring the cost of healthcare down $1,000 a month for a family. And unfortunately, the only way we're going to get this done, I'm afraid, is through reconciliation. Heck, we may have to even finish the farm bill through reconciliation. I think my friends across the aisle are pretty dug in that they're not going to give President Trump any win. Those are things that should pass on a bipartisan basis, but based upon the actions of the Democrats that I see, they're not interested. So onward and upward with a reconciliation bill that can get by with 50 votes rather than 60.
Well, Dr. Marshall, you have to keep your stethoscope handy here because there was important testimony we want to ask you about in the U.S. Surgeon General nominee, Casey Means, before the Senate Health Committee. Of course, you are a member. Democrats highlighted a lot of concerns in questioning the approach to vaccine guidance, alleged ethics concerns, her paid promotion of wellness products on social media. Do you share those concerns?
I'm excited about Dr. Means being the next Surgeon General. What we can talk, she's not going to be focused on vaccines. Her focus is going to be on making America healthy again. That she's going to be focused on what real nutrition looks like, quality nutrition, getting away from processed foods, for instance, then decreasing the environmental toxins, decreasing the toxins in our food as well. I think there's a growing swell of people out there, and they're typically young moms and dads and a lot of grandmothers out there that want to make sure that their kids are healthier, that right now the people that are being born today, their life expectancy is lower than senior citizens. So I think that's going to be her focus. She's going to have an incredible opportunity to be a spokesperson. Much like when I was growing up, the Surgeon Generals led the cause to stop smoking. And then who was Dr. Koch that helped us get through the AIDS crisis as well. So I think this is a great moment. If we have 70-80% of Americans with a chronic disease of some sort, very much impacted by nutrition and a lack of exercise, we need to be focused on that side of healthcare. She'll do a great job with it.
Well, I guess we'll see when we have a vote to advance her nomination or a full confirmation vote on the Senate floor. Senator, I'm also wondering when, if ever, we're going to see a vote to fund the Department of Homeland Security, which is now shut down for day 12 we are in now. Do you have any sense of what the path forward and what timeline we're talking about here is?
Yeah, I think so. March 3rd is the first day that the TSA folks will be missing a paycheck. That's next week, March the 3rd. And I'm going to expect to see a very much of some type of a Schumer viral syndrome that day, that people are staying home because Chuck Schumer won't pay them. Chuck Schumer and President Trump are going to reach a deal eventually. I think it's going to come from the outcry of the American people say, look, we don't like standing in line, trying to get onto our airplanes, that type of thing. So maybe next week we'll see some movement. I sure hope so.
All right, Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas, thank you so much for joining us. And joining us now for more from the other side of the aisle is Democratic Congressman Joe Morelle of New York. He is ranking member on the House Administration Committee, also serves on the House Appropriations Committee. And, sir, given that seat on appropriations, I'll ask you the same question when it comes to funding the Department of Homeland Security. The president in the State of the Union last night was pointing the finger at your party for the fact that it remains shut down. Are we closer to a resolution here to open it back up?
Well, sadly, I don't think we've made much progress. And I think the last time I was on your show, I suggested we could fund TSA, we could fund the Coast Guard, we could fund FEMA. We can do all of that, even as we continue to have discussions about the future of ICE and what it ought to do and what the standards that ought to be. So this is not the Democrats doing this. Is Republicans really using those agencies as leverage to be able to stop the kinds of reforms that not only Democrats in Congress want, but the American people want.
What's the breaking point on this, Congressman? We've talked to some Republicans who are concerned about that idea, and even some Democrats. Debbie Wasserman Schultz suggested that Democrats would lose leverage if you siphoned off ICE funding and took care of the rest here. Is the break going to come when federal workers start missing paychecks?
Well, look, I think that we will not lose leverage. Here's the, as we've talked about, I think when I was on your show last time, because of the reconciliation last year, ICE has enough funding for 7 years of operations, so they can continue to operate. I think the importance of getting these agencies funded, TSA, the Coast Guard, is so important and so vital to the American people. We ought to do it. We'll continue, as we should, talking about reforms to ICE, but we've got to make sure these other important, critically important agencies are funded.
Well, the president last night called for restoration of that funding. He also had a few asks of Congress, legislation he would like to see passed, including things like a stock trading ban for members of Congress, things like the Save America Act, legislation for the Most Favored Nation clause when it comes to the pricing of drugs in this country. Are any of those efforts ones that you could get behind, Congressman, in a bipartisan manner?
Oh, well, I'm very much involved in the Stop Trading Act and the ban on it. I think it ought to extend, however, to the president and the vice president of the United States. I mean, the president is involved economically in turning his office into an operation of print money for himself and his family. So I'm for it. Unfortunately, the Republican proposal doesn't actually do that. That's the name of the bill, but it actually doesn't stop people from trading or holding individual stock. But I'm very much involved in that and want to see that pass. I'll continue to fight for it in the House. In fact, I am working on a discharge petition, which has over nearly 180 members of the House ready to go on an actual ban so that members of Congress, the president, the vice president, could not hold, could not trade individual shares of stock.
Yeah, I'm looking at this discharge petition, Congressman. You signed up with Pramila Jayapal, I see. Did you say 180 or 108? How close are you to getting this to the floor?
No, 180. I'm sorry, my voice has been lost. All the cheering I did last night.
It was a late night, I know.
It was a late night. So 180, we're only about 30 votes short of getting the bill onto the floor. That would stop the ability of members of Congress from owning stock, from trading stock, as well as the president and vice president.
We'd like to stay in touch with you on this, Congressman.
You asked me about the America Act. I just want to say the president continues to insist that there's rampant voter fraud in America. It's a lie. There's no rampant voter fraud. If there were, and the way he suggests, it's curious that there's a Republican in the White House and they control both houses of Congress. If we were so good at rampant voter fraud, why would that be the case? The truth is, it's disingenuous. It would give voter data to the Department of Homeland Security. It would put all kinds of barriers to registering to vote in America. It disenfranchises students, women, veterans. It makes it just harder to register. And this is not, what the president said last night is wrong. It is not a privilege to vote in America. Mr. President, it's a right to vote in America.
Well, it doesn't seem to have legs in the Senate right now from what we're seeing, Congressman. We'd like to stay in touch with you on that discharge petition. It's important to our audience. Joe Morelle, Congressman from New York, we thank you for the time. Coming up, Nvidia's earnings call underway right now. Here we go. The stock is up in after-hours trading, and we're learning more as we speak. We'll get an update from Bloomberg Tech co-host Ed Ludlow coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew, smack dab in the middle of an important after-hours earnings season and earnings night. Nvidia out with results, and we've seen the stock move quite a bit with a big pop in the outset and not so much left to our rally as the conference call now gets underway. We check back in with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, who's been listening in to the call following today's results. Ed, what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, the stock has pared its gains, in particular since CEO Jensen Huang was asked about how he interpreted the capital expenditures numbers that his biggest customers posted earlier in this earnings season, and whether, given that they are seeing some impact to cash flow, those capital expenditures go up. He went as far as to say he expects cash flows to improve because in the end, all those investments in Nvidia gear will pay off to his mind, but didn't go as far to sort of give it a forecast on capital expenditures growing. On the political, they got to the issue of China very early in the call. And Nvidia's CFO, Colette Kress, basically said that Nvidia is starting to recognize that its competitors in China, in other words, Chinese domestic chip names working on AI chips, are making progress. And in many cases, they've been bolstered by IPOs, giving them an injection of capital. And they gave a warning that if Nvidia is not given slightly more freedom in its ability to do business with China or elsewhere in the world, then those Chinese players will impact the future of the American tech stack overseas, which was interesting. And, in the moment on the tape, maybe it was something taken into account by those shareholders.
All right, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, thank you so much. And of course, you can catch Ed alongside Caroline Hyde every morning on Bloomberg Tech at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg TV. But we want to turn back to the top political story here in Washington, the day after spin of President Trump's State of the Union address, in which he declared the country is winning.
Our country is winning again. In fact, we're winning so much that we really don't know what to do about it. People are asking me, please, 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 Mr. President, we're winning too much. We can't take it anymore. We're not used to winning in our country. Until you came along, we're just always losing, but now we're winning too much.
This was leading up to the moment where he welcomed the gold medal winning U.S. men's hockey team into the chamber. Joining us now with more is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic strategist Adam Hodge, managing director at Bully Pulpit International, alongside Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller, senior vice president at Rock Solutions. Welcome to you both. Obviously, the president, in addition to saying the country is winning, had a lot of not self-congratulations, but looking back on things that he views himself as having accomplished so far in office. My question, Lisa, is did he give us enough of an idea of what he still intends to accomplish? What's going to come next with nearly 3 full years left in his presidency?
The president's speech, for the first time in any speech that I can remember, front-loaded the conversation about how well things were going, as if he were anticipating that the viewers would watch for probably the first 30 minutes, and then they would turn away. And then he talked about policies and proposals and other things. But it was light on proposals. And I think it's light on proposals because the likelihood of the Congress actually taking up any of these proposals is unlikely because of the way the map and the way that the majority looks in the House and really how the cards are stacking up in the Senate. So it was an interesting, it was the showman on display yesterday for sure.
Yeah, I'm not tired of winning as much as tired of a very late night.
Yeah, you're just tired.
Almost 2 hours long. We touched a lot. And as a communications expert, you can both, I'm sure, weigh in on this. There's a point of diminishing returns. I mean, obviously the length is one thing, but when you're reaching for that many topics and also trying to engage and criticize members across the aisle, does this have an effect? Did the president move the needle on his approval ratings?
No, and look, Joe, he went into the night at roughly 40% approval, 59% disapproval, average of polls. It was a lazy speech because he didn't do anything in the speech to really dent or really move the needle on those numbers or give Republicans who are up in tough races in midterms much leg to stand on to run with to try to increase their margins. And, tariffs obviously was the front and center of issue for him. It's been a brutal week after the Supreme Court ruling. You got nothing in the speech last night to give businesses any clarity, any confidence that there's going to be a resolution to this issue going forward. So it seemed a bit of a missed opportunity. And Lisa, I think you're right. After the first half hour, after the U.S. hockey team came out and that was an amazing moment, most people probably turned it off and went to sleep or switched to Survivor or whatever else was on last night.
I do want to get your take, both of you, on developments we're seeing right now at this moment on what happened off the shores of Cuba today. Cuban authorities killing 4 individuals aboard a speedboat that was tagged to Florida off the coast of Cuba. We're hearing now from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is in the Caribbean. Actually, he was in St. Kitts and Nevis meeting with Caribbean leaders. He says they've been made aware of the incident in Cuba, that most of the information at this time is from Cuban authorities. They expect to know more shortly. The Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security, is involved in looking into this incident, but they say U.S. government officials were not involved in the incident as they try to verify the information we're getting from the Cuban government. Just knowing the background context here, Adam, given your experience on the National Security Council as well, that we have seen some hot rhetoric around Cuba from Rubio, from President Trump in recent days. Just how quickly could this situation snowball depending on the outcome of the facts here?
I mean, look, having been in the Situation Room, I know what they're thinking through is like just get as much facts, as much intel as they can possibly pull together about what the boat was, what it was doing, where it came from. But I think there's a real risk of escalation here. And I think the challenge, this administration, people like Pete Hegseth, others who've been in this like shoot first, ask questions later, really raises questions about whether they're going to have the judgment to just get all the facts and figure out what is a proportional response, if one is even merited in the first place. We don't know the facts yet. It's still a little too early to tell, but I would have some concerns given the rhetoric that's come out of this administration that they could sort of shoot first, ask questions later.
Well, you're echoing the Secretary, Marco Rubio, saying, I have every reason to want our own information. We don't make decisions based on information given to us. But, of course, we know what the line from the administration has been. And the president on Air Force One just days ago, we just heard that remark played back, Lisa, suggested that the Cuban regime is already falling, that this is essentially destined. So what happens? Is that the new Greenland? Do we move into Cuba?
Oh, I really don't. I don't know the answer to that. I will say, though, that everything in the White House in Washington is looked at through the political lens in an election year. And for sure, any messaging on being strong against Cuba is incredibly helpful in swing states that matter. And so that, to me, I look at it through the lens of whether or not this is a calculated decision because of the amount of political sway this conversation can very well have.
Here's a little bit just on the tactical military side of this, though, that is worth keeping an eye on. We just had a bunch of boats and aircraft carriers and ships in the Caribbean outside of Venezuela. They steamed across the Atlantic Ocean to get to the Middle East and positioned for a potential strike on Iran. We'll see what happens there. So that, like this incident, but they've been saber rattling and driving up the rhetoric on Cuba. So are we prepared for an actual event here back in our hemisphere? And so I think that is the lack of planning and strategy that I think gives some people in the national security space some concern that they're having the right judgment and thoughts on this issue.
Well, to Adam's point about the resources that have been deployed now to the Middle East, the president last night on the issue of Iran made it clear that he's still hoping, or his first choice would be for diplomacy to prevail. And we're going to see diplomatic efforts again in Geneva tomorrow. Lisa, do you think he struck the right chord for the America First base who was listening to him last night?
This to me is very tenuous and worrisome, and I think a lot of folks are really watching to see. I think we were looking for, those of us who are watching the speech closely, were watching for some signals about what it was and where it was the president's head was in all of this. I think it's going to be interesting to see. It's clear that Iran has some questions about the negotiating good faith that the U.S. and Trump have in this conversation that will happen tomorrow. It's really hard to tell, but I do think that, to Adam's point, this is one that has a lot of people very concerned.
Just real quick, I mean, there was no clarity from the president about why it matters to the American people, why you put service members in harm's way, what the payoff is, and what the plan is for actually getting...
Well, he said you can't have the #1 state sponsor of terror with a nuclear weapon. That was the justification, no?
But I thought we got rid of the nuclear weapons back in October, right? I mean, like, I thought we would solve that problem. So clearly we didn't. And so the question is, how do they actually commit resources in a way that makes strategic sense for the American people? We're still waiting to hear.
It's almost 24 hours later, and we're still asking a lot of questions. Adam Hodge, Lisa Camuso-Miller, in the wake of the State of the Union, we thank you both, and we'll meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.